Hey. It's about time for our another office hours session today. Move my stuff around my screen. I'm hoping that you can hear me and you can see me as well. Be really great if someone would take a minute and in the chat, just jump in and at the bottom in the chat or wherever it is in wherever you're watching this, just let me know that you can both see me and you can hear me. This month, this is our May installment, or my May installment of my office hours slash AMA, my Ask Me Anything. Couple little things I want to share with you at the beginning, just like usual. So I will run through those really quick. And then I got a couple questions that some people have submitted ahead of time. And then if you've got any other questions, please feel free and submit them. So let me go ahead and you can submit those using the chat. And let me just double check one thing. Cool. Yes, just wanted to make sure that I had my office hour, I had the Discord up. All right, so let me switch over to my slides. And let me explain kind of what I like to do in these office hours for those of you who are new. In these office hours, I like to cover a couple different things. I like to talk a little bit about what's new. It's all related to Microsoft 365 development topics. So this week, I've got some stuff related to the SharePoint Framework, a bit of news that snuck in. I think just yesterday it snuck in, but it's been kind of semi-public for about 2 weeks now, but I'll touch on that in just a minute. I've got some stuff related to Microsoft Teams, and then we'll tackle your questions. The way that I like to hold these office hours, the way I like to do questions, is if you submit your questions ahead of time, which you can do using you can use the YouTube chat where I'm live streaming this. You can submit your questions there, and as I get to the part in a minute, I'll go through and I'll answer any questions that have come up. But if you're a student of mine and you subscribe to or you've enrolled in either my Teams accelerator program, my Microsoft Teams accelerator program, or you've signed up to my office hours, or sorry, you've enrolled in my Mastering the SharePoint Framework course, where you've got access to a channel inside of my community, which I implement using Discord. There is a channel called Office Hours. There's a link, or there's a separate post just for this office hours where you can submit questions. My students always get their questions answered first before anybody else. Once I've gone through all the student questions, then I will more than happy jump in and look at the questions that have been posted here in the YouTube chat. I will tell you, if you're a student and you post it to the YouTube chat live, based on screen names and that you've set up with YouTube, I may or I may not recognize your name, and so you need to give me a little bit of a heads up. If you're that's why I suggest you go to Discord and post your question there, so I know that if you're in that channel, you are a student of my class. Okay, so let's go ahead and get this kicked off. Let's look first at the SharePoint Framework. So here at the SharePoint Framework, the current version of the SharePoint Framework that we're on is the version 1.19 that came out on the last day, or the second to last day in April. There's very little that's in this. They wanted to get this pushed out really before the conference. I think it was 2 weeks ago in Orlando, the Microsoft 365 community conference. And then they also wanted to get it pushed out prior to Build, which is next week in Seattle. There's only really two or three things that are in this. One of them is a new feature, and the other one's just some housekeeping stuff. The first one I'll list here is they say they've decoupled the build time, some of the build time packages from the actual SharePoint Framework release. And so in this case here, that's just two packages: the ESLint plugin for SharePoint Framework and the SP module interfaces package. Now, a lot of us had these questions. Well, why did you do this? What was the reasoning behind breaking out some of these packages from the main SharePoint Framework reference? And to be honest, they said that they were going to go document this, but that was like 3 months ago that they said they were going to do that, and maybe 2 months ago. Regardless, it's been a while, and they haven't followed through on that commitment. So we really don't know why they did this. We don't know, what they're doing in the future. They said they wanted to have a little more flexibility and not having to release a new version of the SharePoint framework, or they want to do other updates. But specifically these two packages, like why? What was the reasoning for this? And so we're just kind of, I'm sharing it with you, but I can't really give you any explanation as to why they did this, which is a little frustrating. Another thing that I wanted to highlight with this, though, is that they did update Webpack in the latest version of the SharePoint framework from version 4 to version 5. It's kind of an infrastructure-like thing. There's not too much that's all that important here to focus on that we're going to take advantage of with this. It's just nice they're modernizing their under-the-cover stuff. What I would like to see is if we actually get some real modernization stuff, like using the latest version of Fluent UI React, or using the latest version of React. We are still on a version of React that I think is 2 years old, React 17.0.1. Depending on when you watch this, if you're watching it live, I still might be outdated. But the version of React that is currently published is version React 18 is the current major version. But today, I think at the exact same time that I'm recording this, or that I'm live streaming these office hours, there's an online React conference going on YouTube that you can go watch, where they're going to release the next version of React 19. So by the time I think that this office hours is over, SharePoint Framework will still, and SharePoint Online will now be 2 major versions behind the published version of React. So if you don't like that as much as I don't like that, then make Microsoft aware of it. Push it, and hammer away on those. I just saw a question by Anthony in the Discord. I want to tackle that one now because of because it's a little timely on this update. Anthony was saying that the version of the SharePoint Framework, when it got released, version 1.19, was supposed to also be including the latest version of Fluent UI React v9. I can't confirm that. From what I've seen, the answer is no. But that I have not seen them do that update. This was, a lot of stuff was not included in 1.19 because they were rushing to get this last thing that I'm going to cover out the door. When it comes to Fluent UI React, there are some things that Microsoft is doing. Let me just take one peek here at one thing. And yeah, that's correct. Yeah, so I do not think that was included in the update. That was not included in this update as in 1.19. Good question, Anthony. The last thing that they did here. Oh, sorry, let me go back to the Fluent UI React update. What we have seen is when you look at SharePoint Online, if you when you go to a page in SharePoint Online, if you open up the browser's dev tools and look at all the JavaScript libraries that are being loaded on the page, you will see a bunch of like shims that it looks like they're deploying to kind of get ready to do this transition from Fluent UI React v8 to v9. They're still shims. They haven't made the change yet, so we're still waiting on that one to get fully rolled out. Another thing, though, the one new feature that they did add that they're very proud of this one, is a new adaptive card extension template. So we have the option now to be able to have a data visualization card. I got an example of 2 different implementations of it here on the slide. Basically, what this allows you to do is to provide a series of data or multiple series of data, and they will be charted in this little chart component that you see listed here. There's a little more information about this in the release notes. I wrote a tutorial, or I contributed to a tutorial that is in the docs that shows how to add one of these multiple series. But I'm not entirely sure. Like, there's not a whole lot to it. You basically just added some data, and if you have multiple series, you can define the color of the line that you want used here. I see in the chat, Kurt, you said, what does that mean? So it's a little hard to know what you mean by that. What do you mean when you say that? What, can you like elaborate on that? Because it's on that. What you see in the YouTube live stream is about 20 to 30 seconds behind when I say it. So when you say that, I've already moved on to something else potentially, and I'm not really sure what you're referring to. So, yeah. And I see, Jove, you said, it's really annoying that the SharePoint Framework development is locked up to Webpack only. I would like to see it on Vite. I don't disagree with you. It's things like the version of like the different tooling that we use, like things like we're dated when we're using Webpack. We're dated if we're using Gulp. A lot of projects don't use either one of these tools anymore. They're just older tools. I mean, some people still like Webpack, and that's not a bad thing. But I don't disagree with you. I would prefer to use Vite as well. Unfortunately, I don't ever expect that to change with the SharePoint framework until they really invest on doing a complete reset of the tooling for the SharePoint framework and give us more flexibility. Unfortunately, I don't expect them to do that anytime soon, if ever. It just seems like they're just not interested in investing in the technical debt that they have with the tooling. So a little bit of a downside. Kurt, so yeah, you said the version of React being behind. So what it means is that what I meant by that before was that the SharePoint framework is currently set, and SharePoint Online is currently set to use React version 17. That version of React was released over 2 years ago. The next major version was 18. That came out, I think, a year ago. And then 19 is coming out today. When the React team is coming out with these new updates, like with anything, there's either performance improvements or there's new capabilities, new features that we can take advantage of. And we are just not able to use that stuff in our SharePoint framework components that we create for SharePoint Online and the SharePoint framework, because when we do this stuff, we are stuck to using the version that SharePoint makes available to us. We can't just all of a sudden go use a brand new one just because we want to be able to use a brand new one. So it kind of sucks in that sense. A good example of this though is like when you look at React 19, there's a lot of stuff in React 19 that is a lot of like performance optimization stuff, less code that we have to write, things that they've realized that they can do even better and are more performant. So it kind of sucks because we're stuck in older with the older version. We can't take advantage of the latest stuff. That's one of the downsides to using the SharePoint framework. If you're like when you're using something like a Microsoft Teams and you're building an app for Microsoft Teams, you have full control over everything. So like the question about React, I can use the latest version the second it's out. I can use it. React or Teams doesn't care what version of what UI controls or what UI version you're going to use. We've been using like Fluent UI React v9, which is the latest version in Teams apps. We've been doing that, been able to do that for a while now. Can't do that in SharePoint Online. Like back to Joe's point there, it's really annoying. We're locked to Webpack and we can't use Vite. I don't disagree with that. And if you want to use Vite, you could use Vite in your Teams apps. Then the fact that you can package up your Teams apps and deploy them as a tab, and you could deploy it to SharePoint Online as a web part or a single page app, then you kind of get the best of both worlds. You have none of the restrictions the SharePoint framework gives you, but your app can now work inside SharePoint Online. Although we will come back to that in just a minute, and we'll see if that's really going to do anything, or if that's going to change in the future. I don't know, but I'm going to bring some stuff up that I think we need to keep an eye on. Kurt's follow-up question, you're asking if this means that Microsoft is leaning away from the SharePoint framework. I don't see that happening. So no, it doesn't mean that Microsoft is leaning away from the SharePoint framework. It just means that they are not staying as current with all of the different libraries and packages that are available to us. So case in point, SharePoint framework, the generator now, version 1.19 now uses Webpack 5. Webpack 5 has been out for a while. In fact, if I can do a quick little check on this, When was... Here's a great example of this. Webpack 5 was released in October of 2020. So this is 3.5 years. You could argue almost 4 years. But 3.5 years after the current major version of Webpack was released, now the SharePoint framework supports it. That is like ancient in some stuff. So it's frustrating. Jove, I see your follow-up there about a workaround about using Vite. You said one thing about you can use Alt test version of React or Vue. So if you're saying you can use an alternative version of React on SharePoint Online, I'd strongly caution you from doing that, because React is not intended to have itself on the page twice, nor in having multiple versions on the page. I've seen multiple customers with multiple issues in trying to do this. So my recommendation is do not do this. If you do it, it's kind of up to you. You're on your own, and that's very, very risky. So just be careful about using different versions of React. Okay, so now let's go on to my next slide here. Please. Okay, now big news around the SharePoint framework. This is the thing that kind of got slipped in the last couple days. This is the fact that the Microsoft has announced that they are going to retire isolated web parts. So what are these isolated web parts? Let me get myself out of the way. So what does this mean? So take a step back. What are isolated web parts? Why do we use them? In a SharePoint framework application or SharePoint framework web parts, if you do anything with, what do you call it? Anything with like this, with a web component or a web part that needs custom permissions. So like say mail.read access to your mailbox. Those permissions, when you grant them, you're not granting them to the SharePoint framework or to your web part. You're granting them to the entire SharePoint Online tenant. So any component, any client-side component can request using the SharePoint, really just using a REST request, but using the SharePoint Framework API, you can request a access token for Microsoft Graph, and regardless of what component you're using, you can even do it straight from like the developer tools in the browser, and you will get an access token back for all the permissions that SharePoint Online has been granted, including mail.write. Now granted, well, at least you should only be using delegated permissions in this case. Don't use application permissions. And so you at least know that the access token still is only good to be used with the current user. So, but I want to make sure you understand that that permission is not tied to a specific SharePoint framework component. So the way that we addressed this was that Microsoft added a capability called isolated web parts. What these did is that when you enabled this, your web part was no longer run. Let me take a step back and explain why this was done, or how this was done. In the previous example I gave you, when a SharePoint Framework web part, when it requests an access token to be able to call Microsoft Graph or any other secured endpoint, the request is going back to a server-side API that is hosted on SharePoint, that is effectively saying, go give me an access token for SharePoint Online for the current user. What that server-side API is doing is it's checking to see that that request came from the current tenant. So it knows that by looking at the URL of the tenant. It does not, and it cannot look at which component did it, because all it knows is the request came from a client, from a browser. So that could be your web part, but it could also be a different web part. It could even be from the JavaScript console, the browser's JavaScript console, because it's doing that based on the domain name. So what Microsoft did is they created this concept of isolated web parts. And what these do is that when the web part is enabled, has the isolated web part feature turned on, the web part is no longer rendered in a div inside of the current tenant. Instead, it's rendered inside of an iframe, and that iframe has a custom domain associated with it. That domain is also tied to a new Azure AD app or Microsoft Intra application that is tied also to that domain. So now when your web part requests an access token for the current SharePoint Online site, it knows that this request is only for, it knows that this request is just for that one component, because it can tie it back to that domain name. Well, what Microsoft has done is they've said they're going to get rid of isolated web parts, meaning we're going to lose this capability for web parts. I'll give you my thoughts on it in just a minute, but let me just tell you exactly how it's going to work. Effectively, what they're telling you is right now it's not retired, but in about a little less than a year, any new SharePoint Online tenant that is created after April the 2nd, 2025, they will not have the isolated web part capability turned on. It will not be enabled. But if you already have a tenant today, you've already provisioned the tenant, you can continue to use isolated web parts all the way up to April the 2nd, 2026. So just under 2 years from now. It seems like April the 2nd is the day that every service is going to get killed in SharePoint. Not everyone. I'm being a little extreme there. 4 services now we know are going to get shut off. Azure Access Control Services, that was announced last November. It was going to get shut off. SharePoint 2013 workflows, the SharePoint add-in model, so provider and hosted add-ins will all be shut off in April 2026. And now we're also seeing isolated web parts get shut down. Microsoft's guidance is for you to start migrating your solutions to something else. Now, let me explain the why, and then let me give you my commentary on this. But all they've said in the article, so I have an article, this was the subject of my newsletter yesterday. So if you want to read the article for my newsletter, you can go check it out at that URL right there. It is not showing up on the website. It won't show up until next week. It's because people who subscribe to the newsletter get my articles a week early. But you can still get to it. It's just not showing up in the index or anything. You have to type in the URL exactly, or sign up to my newsletter. The why they're doing this, they've said they're not very explicit in the article that they've published. They're effectively doing this because they are taking the stance. My interpretation of having a couple conversations with them is they're taking the stance that iframes are bad. And specifically, they're bad in this case. They're bad in this scenario because if you have lots of iframes on a page, the performance kind of sucks on the page. It can get pretty poor because you've got multiple requests going in full stacks of going through the entire SharePoint like authentication stack to go get the eventual endpoint that you want, but you've got to go through all the other like authentication pieces. You've got to do all the loading of the entire page, of the rendering of the SharePoint framework of the runtime inside of where that web part's loading. It's going to be a little bit slower, but it works. Now, one of the other challenges that they say with this about iframes is that there are, in the last year or so, there's been a push by a lot of the browser manufacturers to, on a privacy standpoint, primarily because of what Apple did in the iPhone and iOS, and actually all of their OSs, iPadOS and macOS, around limiting the tracking, which is usually done by third-party cookies. And so a lot of browsers Safari already blocks it, and now we've got the other browsers that are the Chromium-based browsers like Google Chrome and Microsoft Edge are also not passing along are not using those third-party cookies. And because of the way the SharePoint's authentication works with like third-party cookies, you can run into issues with this. And not just SharePoint's authentication, but how Azure AD also leverages it as well. It can cause issues with this. So they're saying there's lots of issues around using iframes, so they're moving away from it. Now here's my take on it. Personally, I think this sucks. I think it's a bad idea. I think that it's perfectly fine that if you just educate people and say like, look, you shouldn't put lots of isolated web parts on a page because it could impact the performance of the page. I don't disagree with that. Just like I don't disagree with the fact that on on company intranet, some marketing guy should be putting a 15 megabyte TIFF file on the homepage of the intranet for the company. But is there anything in SharePoint that stops you from doing that? No, it's just good practice, good guidance. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't cuss. You shouldn't use explicit language on the homepage of your intranet. But is there anything blocking you from doing that? No, there's not. Same thing with this. I think that there are scenarios where this makes a lot of sense to be able to use isolated web parts, and for Microsoft to just say that we're going to shut this service off, to me is I think it's a bad decision. They did say in the article when they published it that there is I can't remember exactly how they announced it, but essentially they said a yet to be announced improvements or feature that they will be announcing later that will address this. So you want me to actually, so let me get this straight. They want us to go through and start migrating our solutions to something else, but then they say, hey, we're going to give you something that's going to make this a little bit better, but we're not going to tell you what it is because we're still working on it, but you should start migrating. I'm sorry. I don't buy that, and I think that's crappy guidance. So what my guidance is for you is they do give us a PowerShell script. Unfortunately, it's PowerShell, but they do give us a PowerShell script that we can run in our tenant and get a list of all of the SharePoint framework all the SharePoint packages that have been deployed that contain a isolated web part in them. And it'll also give us a list of all of the pages where those isolated web parts are being used. So we can get an inventory of what we have and figure out how big of a deal is this going to be. Microsoft says not many people are actually using isolated web parts. I think it's because they don't really understand what the security implications are, because almost every customer that I talk to, when they find out that, hey, the permissioning doesn't work the way that we thought it did, we didn't realize that when we were giving one of these scopes to our app, it wasn't being given to the app, it was being given to the entire tenant. Once they realize that, their eyes get real wide and it's like, wow, we don't want to do that. I'm like, well, you have isolated web parts. Like, cool, that'll solve the problem. So I think that they're like, well, we looked at our telemetry. I'm like, well, your telemetry is misleading because the way that you did stuff doesn't really give you good data to be able to make this decision. So I think it's flawed just from top to bottom. What my guidance would be is go ahead and get an inventory of what you got, but don't do anything. Just know that you're probably going to need to do something, but you've got about a year, a little under a year, like 11 months, it looks like, a little less than 11, a little less than, what would that be? 12, a little less than 23 months before you have to actually make a change. I'd wait to see what they're going to end up releasing. I think I'd like to see what they're going to release because it may end up being a better option. But we don't know what that is. They haven't shared that publicly yet. The concern that this brings up for me, though, I have a couple concerns with this. Not only the ones I've already shared, but here's a couple of the concerns I have. So first of all, a minute ago, I said that how you could, how with the SharePoint framework, I can build a web part, and I can also have that web part be a tab in Microsoft Teams. So I can deploy it over as a tab in Microsoft Teams or as a personal app, which is really just a personal tab and not a channel tab. I can do the inverse as well. I can create a tab in Microsoft Teams, and I have an option to say this is available as a web part inside of SharePoint Online or as a single page app, or SharePoint calls it a full page app, but a single page app inside of SharePoint Online. Well, when you take that Teams tab and you deploy it to SharePoint Online as a web part, the way that gets implemented is using an iframe. So that iframe is going to be added to a page. It's going to point to the URL of where that tab is actually is hosted. So if you don't like iframes, and if the whole point of isolated web parts going away is to effectively get rid of iframes, then we're going to lose the ability to have a Teams tab get deployed to SharePoint as a web part, right? And that's my question to them. I haven't seen an answer that really confirms that yet. But that sure sounds like if we go to the logical conclusion on this, shouldn't the Teams group now have to issue a deprecation notice or a retirement notice saying that this feature is no longer supported with SharePoint Online? Seems like it to me. Is that going to just apply to web parts, or is that also going to apply to single page apps? We don't know. So those are some questions I have outstanding for the SharePoint engineering team when they publish this guidance. Haven't got an answer back yet. So I guess stay tuned. As I said in the newsletter, though, I will update that article that I have linked there on the slide once I get confirmation of this, whatever it ends up being, if they're going to kill it off or not, for either one. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to cover around SharePoint Framework. Let's talk a little bit about Microsoft Teams. I don't see any questions about SharePoint Framework, so let's just keep going. Actually, I do have one question. Let me jump ahead to our student questions, because Andrea had a question that was related to this, and I want to go ahead and tackle it now because, well, it's related to this. So Andrew says, if isolated web parts are officially being retired, should we be concerned about all SharePoint frameworks being retired in the future? And I wonder if this is a general way for Microsoft to say, please go the Power App way instead. So no, I wouldn't go this far. I really wouldn't go this far, and I really don't think there's a chance of this happening. I do not expect web parts to be retired in the future. It is only about isolated web parts that are being addressed here. Of course, we can't read into the future to see what they're going to do, but I do not think that that's the case. There are way too many things that we can do with web parts that we cannot do with Power Apps. So I do not think that this. I'm not at all concerned about this. About this happening. This is just related to isolated web parts. It has nothing to do with regular web parts, because regular web parts are rendered in a div, whereas isolated web parts are rendered in an iframe. It's the iframe that's the issue here. That's it. Furthermore, web parts are the way that you customize and extend Viva connections as well. And I can't see them in addition to adaptive card extensions, but web parts is the way to do it. I can't see Microsoft getting rid of this. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that. Okay, let's jump back. So let me go back to where I was. Teams. Let's talk a little bit here about some stuff related to some Microsoft Teams updates. Some of the updates around Microsoft Teams is that I've started to see a few things leading up to the Build conference. So Microsoft Build is in Seattle next week. I forget the exact date, but it's a week after this. I think the first day is like next Tuesday. I've started to see a few updates. Actually, this morning is when I saw them. I wasn't awake when they actually made the updates, but I did see them in my notifications. It looks like they are going to publish or announce a new version of the Microsoft Teams Toolkit. We were on version 5.6, but they just pushed version 5.8. That version just snapped in the GitHub repository. I have not seen it get published to the Visual Studio Code marketplace yet, so it's not available to us, but I can see they made this change. This happened at about, as of recording, it happened at about 8 hours ago. So 3:45 this morning Eastern time, or 7:45 a.m. GMT, or a little after midnight if you were in Redmond where they were doing this. Another thing that I noticed they did is they also snapped all of the project templates. So they are now version 4.2.1. What does that mean? I haven't had a chance to go through all these and see what the changes are that they're putting in this, but they did do a bunch of updates to the project templates. Not entirely sure what, but I will do some investigation and I will follow up on what things that they've updated here. The toolkit's a little bit harder to understand, like what they made changes to, because it's hard to know what features have been added, because even the change log and the release notes all still point to the previous versions. So they haven't even gone to the point of even updating the change logs yet, which I guess isn't that surprising because Build is next week, so they're going to want to make some announcements. So something's coming. Don't know how big of a deal it is. Don't know if it's minor or if it's major, but the Teams Toolkit for Visual Studio Code, that extension did get updated, and it will be version 5.8, at least as of this morning. So we'll have to keep our eye out for that next week. Another thing is the Teams Toolkit CLI. This is the last 2 points I have here. These are rehashes from our last office hours, I still see a bunch of my students getting tripped up by this. So Teams Toolkit, we used to call this the Teams FX CLI. It is now the Teams Toolkit CLI. So we have the Teams Toolkit for Visual Studio, Teams Toolkit for Visual Studio Code, and Teams Toolkit CLI. The Teams Toolkit for Visual Studio Code uses the CLI to do a lot of deployment and provisioning of resources and assets. To get the latest version of this, you're going to have to, you're going to need to install a brand new package. So the old package of Teams FX CLI, that one is still stuck at version 2. something. They've renamed it and they've created a new package for it. So what I would do is uninstall the Teams FX CLI that you had installed if you were a Teams developer, and then install, as you see there in the second bullet point that I have here. Let me get my little laser pointer out. Where's my laser pointer? Laser pointer right here. So I would install this package you see right here that I'm using the laser pointer on. Okay, that's what I'd recommend that you do. Another thing too is that you want to be prepared for the new Teams domain. So Microsoft announced this last year. The rollout is going to happen starting in June, so next month, where the URL of, they call it user-facing Microsoft 365 sites, is going to all be renamed under cloud.microsoft, under that domain. So today we use teams.microsoft.com. This is going to switch to being teams.cloud.microsoft. So all cloud assets, all Microsoft like 365 assets are going to be cloud.microsoft, something.cloud.microsoft. I would presume that also means we're going to see maybe SharePoint do that as well. We're probably going to eventually see Outlook do that. I assume we're going to see all of that stuff. So right now, Teams is the first one that we're really calling out for. The thing you want to be careful with this one is that if you're using a content security policy for your Teams tabs that you're creating and the web app that implements your Teams tabs, if you're using a CSP that says only load this tab or only load this page if it's in an iframe and the parent page is coming from teams.microsoft.com, you want to make sure that you add in this new domain to make sure your tabs will continue to work. All right, and I've got a little more information about it at the link I have there at the bottom of the slide. All right, now I've got time for student questions or for your questions. Now I only have 2 questions here, so I've got plenty of time to go through some questions. If anybody has questions and want to post them into the YouTube, into the chat on YouTube. If you're a student, I'd prefer if you did it inside of the Discord group, but those will get the priority if I see any of them show up. You just want to go to the office hours channel that you have access to in our Discord community, and you'll find an entry for the May 2024 office hours. Otherwise, I'm going to go through everything that we have here in Discord, which I don't have any outstanding in Discord. So I'm going to go through 1 or 2 that have been submitted via email from people before the call. So in one of them, Over submitted 2 questions. So he said in some of his SharePoint Framework projects, the debugger never hits the breakpoints. I got to mark them in the browser's code tab. What can I do to fix it? So this is, I guess, to expand on Over's question, as I would presume you're saying the debugger in Visual Studio Code never hits the breakpoints. Instead, you got to use the browser to do this. I don't really know what I can tell you to fix this, other than the best thing I could say that you could do is, I guess what I was going to say is that fixing this is, in my experience, is hit or miss. You might be successful, you might not. What I would do is before you do the build, I would do a clean. So use gulp space clean, gets rid of everything that you have built in the past in that project, and then do then fire it up, the debugger up, to be able to fire the debugger up using the tools they give you and to attach your breakpoints. However, with that being said, I find it very hit or miss. In fact, I don't use any of the debugging stuff that we have in Visual Studio Code because it's just unreliable. I find that the debugging stuff, like the experience you're running into, I get this all the time, And a lot of times it just doesn't make sense why that is. Actually, another thing that you may have an issue with is that when you launch the debugger, this is a common thing I see people run into, and this is actually one of the reasons why I don't use Visual Studio Code for this. If you're using whichever browser you're using, so Edge or Chrome to do your testing, before you start the debugging session, you have to kill all instances of that browser. So if you've got Chrome up and running and you've got 2 or 3 windows and multiple tabs in each one, you have to kill the entire process. So like on Windows, you have to like quit the app. On Mac OS, you don't just close them, you have to literally kill the app. That process can't be running, because what's happening is that when you start the debugger, what it does is it launches the browser using the command line, and it tells it to open up a specific debugging port. Visual Studio Code is connecting to that debugging port on the browser to be able to get all the instrumentation that Chrome is exporting, so that it knows when the code is hitting that specific line that you're trying to hit. If a browser is already open, when you launch a debugging session, it launches a new browser for you. But if there's already a Chrome instance or an Edge instance running and the debugging port was not turned on, you can't turn it on. You can't turn it on for a new instance. It has to be the very first instance of the browser has to have the debugging port turned on. So the reason I don't like using it is because I mean, who in their right mind these days has all their browsers has no browsers up on their desktop? Especially if you're doing development, you've probably got like some documentation open, or you've got some reference thing open or whatever. You've always got something open. So this is effectively saying, whenever you want to test your stuff, close all your browsers and then try it again. That's absurd. In my mind, that's absurd. So I don't like the way that process works. You could say I only do my testing in Edge while I use Chrome as my main browser, or vice versa, but that gets a little confusing for some people as well. Honestly, that's what I end up doing. Like when I'm doing that with like Teams apps, I let Teams launch Edge because Chrome is my preferred browser. I think Edge sucks, but I'm not a fan of Edge, but that's just a personal preference. You could use one browser for all your dev stuff and then another one for all your main stuff. It doesn't really matter. Incognito doesn't help either. You have to have all instances of that browser completely killed and shut off, not running on your machine, to be the first one to spin up. I find all of that to just be a pain, so I don't use the debugger in those tools. Instead, I go into the Sources tab and the browser's dev tools, and I set my breakpoints that way, and I look at it in the browser. I don't do it inside of VS Code. This is not a Visual Studio Code problem. This is just how browsers work and how they open, and how you can't have a browser. You can't open a port on an existing browser. You have to launch the browser with the port open for that instrumentation to be able to connect and work. Forgot about that until I started explaining that question. So I gave you a couple options of how you could potentially fix it, but there's no guarantee that stuff's going to work. And most of the time I see it doesn't. It's not even reliable. The other question that Ofer had is, what's the best way to overcome the 5,000 list view threshold? You can't get through an office hour session without someone bringing up the 5,000 item limit. Ofer says, I had to start the filter with something that will never amount to 5,000, but it's not always feasible. So I break it into chunks by the create date, but that's a lot of traffic. Your two solutions right there are the only, if you're going to use a list that's going to have more than 5,000 items in it, those are your only two options, right? The data set that comes back must be less than 5,000. You do that with views, you do that with filters, you can do that with paging, but you are limited. You cannot do it. There's no other way around it. You say you break it into chunks by the create date, but that's a lot of traffic. I wouldn't be concerned with that. It's not a lot of traffic when the amount of data that comes across. When you look at the entire payload of a SharePoint page compared to the data that you get from getting 5,000 items in a JSON array. It's not that big of a deal. So I'm not too concerned about that. The real thing is, it's a broken record here, but the real thing is that if you need to work with, if you have over 5,000 items, and you need to be able to rationalize over those 5,000 items, I know a lot of people don't like this answer. I'm gonna say it anyway. You need to look at why you have that much data in there, and is a list really the right solution for this? And it's no. You probably, most of the time, the answer is no. You need to create a database and do this in a database. But well, that's it. I mean, that's just full stop. You can't. That's your story. So you can't. There's no other way around that. So sorry, but is what it is. I don't see any other questions here. We've still got another 15, 16 minutes to go. So does anybody have a question that they want to post in the chat, in the live stream chat, that you want to discuss here? While you're doing that, I will throw out a couple things that I want to make sure that everyone is aware of. So a few things here is, okay, here we go. So let's go. So this was the article I talked about earlier that I published that was part of my newsletter, that you can get to. It was in my newsletter yesterday. So if you're not subscribed to my newsletter, if you go to newsletter.voitanos.io, you will find, here's the article. And if you are not subscribed, if you click on this, it will give you an option to subscribe, or to log in if you already are a subscriber. And then you'll be able to get to the newsletter where I offer my thoughts. And you also get a bunch of news related to it as well. So I've tried to level up my newsletter to where not only is it like some insights, and like in this case here, it's the isolated web parts and the retirement notice. But I also have a section where we go deep dive on some of the latest news. So actually, let me show you. I can do this. Stat. And let me grab that code that it's going to send me. Where is the code? There it is. 993-291. So I have just a bunch of stuff here about this is what happened with the newsletter, with the isolated web parts. And then I've got a section about some news about Voitanos. A couple things, just as a little bit of a highlight while I'm waiting for other people to post some questions. Daniel, I saw yours, so I'll come back to those first in just a moment. Anybody a fan of the Microsoft Cloud Show? Well, I'm not starting it again, but I did. Jeremy Fake from Microsoft used to have a podcast called the Microsoft 365 Developer Podcast. And Jeremy and I have been talking for a while, and he is restarting it. It went dormant for about a year, but he's restarting it. I think he's doing it on a bi-weekly cadence. And I'm going to join him as a guest host once a month to cover Microsoft 365 development from the non-Microsoft perspective. So calling Jeremy out on some stuff, asking him some tough questions, but then, not trying to do gotcha moments or anything. So if you're interested in that, check out the Microsoft 365 Developer Podcast. We published our first episode yesterday. This is about the office hours today. So if you're watching this, you don't need that link because you're watching it or you're already watching the recording. Couple other things too. A couple of weeks ago, I launched a email course around Teams application development. It's a free course. My promise to you is in just 10 minutes a day over the course of 9 days, you will get a idea on what's possible and what's involved, what you need and what you would use to create custom apps for Microsoft Teams. This is great for those of you who are SharePoint Framework developers, maybe you're Power App developers, and you're Teams app dev curious. That's what this is. My goal in this is not so much you're going to be able to build an app by the time you finish it. My goal is that by the end of this, you'll be able to say, I'm interested to learn more, or and this might be a solution for our next project, or I don't care, I'm not interested. So not trying to sell you anything like this. It's just an option for you to be able to get a little bit more aware of what's there. I think Microsoft does a poor job of explaining what's possible with this, and it's just overwhelming on how they try and explain this. So instead, I break it down 10 minutes a day. I mean, you could do that on your lunch break. So sign up for that. That's easy to find if you just go to my website. At the very top under courses, if you pick these, pick courses and then pick this second tile about Microsoft Teams, and if you scroll down, here's the email course. It explains everything that you'll learn, and then if you go to the very bottom of the page, you just plug in your name and your email address, starts flowing right at you. The other thing that I wanted to call out here is I also run a multi-week accelerator program for Microsoft Teams app dev. If you want to spend 8 weeks with me, about 4 hours a week, it's split between 2 different live calls, one on Monday and one on Wednesday. And you want to learn everything that you can do around Microsoft Teams app dev. It includes asynchronous coaching throughout the entire program, homework, instructor-led labs to where you can actually build out the same projects. Let me know. Hit me up. You can send me an email, andrew@voitanos.io. I'd love to talk to you about it. The next one starts about actually 2 weeks from today and runs through the middle of July. I still got a few seats available. And if you mention that you saw this on the live stream, then for that next cohort, I'll give you, I'll honor the early bird discount as well, which is I think 20% off. So if you're interested, let me know. There's also that page, so you can learn more about that on the same page where if you went to where the Teams, all my Teams courses are right here, scroll to the very bottom and you'll find the App Dev Accelerator. And there's a little video of me kind of explaining it. And then a little bit farther down, you see some quotes from some of my former students. And then if you want to see quotes from all of my students, scroll to the very bottom here and you'll see a ton of testimonials from all of my former students. All right. Yeah, I'd love to talk to you about that. Last thing is, if you, in the past, I understand that not everybody can how do I say this? The prices for things in the United States can be very expensive to people in other parts of the world because of exchange rates, etc. There is, in the past, I've tried to address this by giving a 40% discount to like 3 or 4 countries for people who live in 3 or 4 countries, and it hasn't. It's worked, but it hasn't worked as well as I would like for it to reach more people, because everyone always has another question like, well, what about this? And what if I live here? So I learned about this honestly in the last couple months, and I've got it set up now. There's a concept called purchasing power parity. And what this is that it looks at a kind of like an equalizer number that will equalize the cost of something based on your country versus the United States on a GDP model. So basically, if someone buys one of my courses in the United States, and it's, say, like my fundamentals bundle of my Mastering the SharePoint Framework course, that's $495. How much is that? Let's just say that's like a portion, a couple hours of work for, like, that's maybe for most SharePoint Framework developers, you're going to make around $100, $150 an hour, I would say. So even on the low end of that, that's like 5 hours of consulting, right? But for someone who lives in India or who lives in Pakistan or in South America or South Africa, that's a lot more expensive because it may take a lot more time to accumulate that kind of revenue to be able to afford that class. So I took a model from a list of all these countries from this one service, 151 countries. And if you go to our site, and you can see the list of countries here, if you go to the very top and go to About, go to Frequently Asked Questions, and under Discounts, you'll see this section on what is purchasing power parity. And if you select this, you will see a list of 151 countries, and you can get, if you live in one of those countries, you can get a discount from 30 to 60% off any of my self-paced courses. If that applies to you, then reach out. All you have to do is contact us. So you go to the contact us page, you enter your name, your email address, say purchasing power parity, tell us where you live, and I'm going to ask you just for some sort of proof if that's where you live. The problem with these things is always that someone's going to abuse them. They're going to create a VPN and try and try and get it in some other way. To make it easy, I'm just going to say send me an email or contact us. Send us some sort of proof of residency. I'll address it that way. You can hide anything that is personally identifiable information. So I don't care like your home address or your ID number or anything like that. But like most people take a picture of their passport with their picture and their name on it. And I can see that it's, from Brazil. I'm like, cool, that's good enough. I just need to see that you live there and not that you're actually living in the United States and you're trying to find an easy way to get a really cheap discount. So that's all it is. Just trying to make it as fair as possible and make sure I can reach as many people as I can. Okay, so those are the things I wanted to cover. Oh, and the other thing with the newsletter as well, I have newsworthy stories, so like stuff around announcements. So there's the isolated web part announcement, and then there's some stuff here around Microsoft Teams, and then some fun stuff, some click-worthy things that maybe aren't announcements or so much, but things that might be interesting to developers. All right, so let me go back over here to our chat, and I can see Daniel's got a question. So let's take a look at it. So Daniel says, today you realize we can't sort SharePoint list items retrieved via the Microsoft Graph API. I hope I'm wrong. Currently porting an app from the SharePoint REST API to Graph API, and I hit a problem with missing sort functionality in the Graph API. So I see Anthony's responding to you. Says you can do sorting with Graph API, but the field really should be indexed to guarantee it. So this would be news to me if you can't sort that. I'd be surprised at that. I will tell you that the only reason when it comes to working with the Graph API to get to SharePoint data, my stance on this is that there's no reason to use Graph because it requires an additional permission unless your app is already needing other Graph permissions. If you only are using the SharePoint REST API to get data, moving to Graph, there's no benefit. In fact, I think it's an overhead because you've got to now you have to get a custom permission or a special permission granted by your tenant administrator. But if you want to use the Graph, if that was news to you, that's news to me as well. I'd be surprised that you couldn't sort on that. But as Anthony's saying, you can do sorting. You just have to make sure that the field is indexed to make sure that you can do the sorting. Another option that you could do with sorting is you can always do a search. Use the search API to get data. Use the filtering capabilities in search to make sure you're filtering down to a specific list, and then you can sort the results you get back from that. Generally, I think that's going to be faster too to get to the data. And properties would be also going to be indexed as well in that case. Cool. We've got 2 minutes left here. Does anybody else have any other questions? Anthony, man, you've been answering a ton of questions in the Discord community as well. I got big shout out to Anthony. Anthony's absolutely awesome, and I appreciate it. I feel like I'm always following up after you. You must have a little more free time right now to be able to having seen the Discord messages pop up. I'm always go back and check it. I look at my phone, I see a bunch of notifications I missed. And then when I go over to Discord, I'm I really don't have to answer this, just other than say yeah, I agree with Anthony. So Anthony in the chat definitely knows what he's talking about. All right. That kind of wraps up our office hours for today. Oh, there we go. That wraps up our office hours for the day. We got about another 30 seconds left, but I'm going to be respectful of your time. One big point here I do want to mention before we go. Oh, let's see if I can get this in. The next office hours. Usually these office hours are always on Wednesdays. Next month, though, it's going to be on a Thursday, June the 20th. The reason for this, well, that Teams Accelerator I told you about, classes are on Wednesday. So I'm going to be teaching that day and I can't do it. So I'm just pushing it back one day later, same time, but it'll be on Thursday. Also, for those of you who want to be notified of when I do these office hours, there is a way when you subscribe to my newsletter and you manage your subscription, which is a link in the footer of every email that I send you once you're on my newsletter. You can opt in or opt out to receive a notification when the next office hours is coming up. I include a mention of it in the bottom of every single email that I send, but in terms of when the next office hours is. But I also will send an email out about a week in advance with details about where you can go, where the next office hours is coming up, and that you can sign up and get notified on YouTube to be able to do that. So that's the big update. Office hours is just pushed one day back from when it normally is for June. I don't know if I have to do this for July now that I think about it, but I'll worry about that when we get to June. All right, everybody. Thanks a lot. I'm going about a minute over, so I'm going to wrap it up right now. Hope everyone has a fantastic rest of their day and happy Microsoft 365 developering. I won't do that again. That doesn't sound good at all. Bye, everybody.